Robert Kirsch is Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Leadership and Interdisciplinarity Studies at Arizona State University and has a faculty affiliation with the School of Politics and Global Studies as well as the university's Honors College. He received his PhD from the Aspect program in 2012. Early enough that graduates were numbered ordinally, so he's grad number 4. Number 4. His research is generally about His research is generally about critical political economy, particularly a Marxist critique of modern monetary theory, Marcusean critical theory, and issues of diversity and inclusion in the university. He has a forthcoming co-authored book from Springer Nature on critical theory in leadership studies coming out later this year. Robert is membership director of the Caucus for a New Political Science and is a founding associate editor of Holland Press, an independent press that publishes Oasis, an anti-capitalist art and literary journal in a desert. He is the principal investigator of an NSF-funded grant on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the geosciences, and is also a key investigator on a food, energy, water system NSF grant for stakeholder communication by scientists. So welcome. Thank you, Robert.
Sorry for the awkward space, but we're really good at inhabiting awkward spaces, right? So let's do that. First thing I want to ask is, well, I was reading this book by Andrew Abbott, and it's called The Chaos of Disciplines. And it's this really great book where he talks about the production, fracturing, reproduction, reassemblage of knowledge, and how disciplines and interdisciplines talk to each other, reinforce each other, and that's what we do in Aspect, right? And that's what I think makes this a really special program. And so I want to know, who decided to use the Mandelbrot fractal as like the logo? Okay. Fractals are a metaphor that we use for interdisciplinarity, and I thought whoever did this, I hope this is like some meta commentary about the production of interdisciplinary knowledge. So, well done. It's, I don't even know what a fractal really is. Okay, and I would like to thank a few people. I really want to thank the conference organizers, fellow presenters, the faculty who are here, all of our alumni, who you are all illustrious, and everybody for attending and for making this conference a success. I've sort of been thrown back into the early history of Aspect during the course of this conference, and it's really impressive where this has come. I remember the first Aspect conference because I presented there because I had to, because Francois read the handbook and said, you know, there's a public demonstration requirement for graduation. When are you all going to do that? And we thought, oh, how's next month in Squires? And so we all got together in one ballroom and talked about our dissertations, and so to see it become this multi-university, international forum for young scholars doing really interesting, critical, interdisciplinary work has been really good to see. And I used to joke, but now it's not a joke, that I rely on you all to make my degree intelligible, right? So when I say I did Aspect, people know what I mean, and they know what I mean now, and so thank you for doing that. Thank you for proliferating Aspect out into the broader academic world. Speaking of proliferation, my journal Oasis, it just has a call for submissions on our next issue on proliferation. Please go to holum, H-O-L-U-M, press.com and consider submitting. We have a call for submissions out. So if you have a paper, a poem, a screenplay that you want to share with some interesting socialists in the Sonoran Desert and broader areas, you should do that. We seize the means of production. We own a printing press, so we just run them off. It's a lot of fun. Okay, that's enough of that. Second thing I want to do is apologize for my title. I've only said social scientists. I should have included the humanities. I'm sorry. I also should have highlighted the interdisciplinary approach to establishing broader impacts, so I'm sorry. Really should have thought that through better. but I'm hoping that this little public Stalinist self-critique nevertheless shows my commitment to interdisciplinary research. Last summer, when Francois asked me to give a plenary lecture that focused on doing sponsored research, I had two immediate reactions to this. I was thrilled to immediately say, yes, I want to talk to people about this. But then I also had a fear that I kind of just got lucky once, right? And I don't know what to say about that except get lucky once, right? But I decided I was going to do this. Obviously, I'm here. And I don't mean to sound ambivalent about sponsored research or getting grants. But I do think, and I want to just surface, that as we all know, and in many other areas of academia, luck and fortuitous timing play a key role. But as we know, if we sharpen our virtue, then the vicissitudes of fortuna can be shaped to our advantage. I'm going to stop with that. And so my talk is not going to be a how-to guide to getting sponsored research. I'm not going to, it's actually a pretty straightforward process. It's also not going to be about the meat of what my grants are doing. I can tell you if you want later, but it really doesn't matter. I'm going to make the broader case that you should, as a tactical, strategic maneuver, consider entering this realm of grant-funded, sponsored research. And I'm going to try to highlight that there are some pretty, I think, severe stakes for the future of interdisciplinary research. That if we get involved with grant work, we have a chance to sort of insert our unique critical voices in a way that will hopefully be fruitful. And so I'm going to talk about my experience with the National Science Foundation, where my grants are all located right now. And so I'm going to kind of run everything through the lens of the NSF, which could be useful for translating some of the grant speak into terms that critical scholars might use if you want to try to gain a foothold. So if you are far enough along in the Aspect program, then you have taken the professional development class. Right? You're all being professionalized all the time, right? And you may have gotten told in week 7 or week 8 that grants are good. And that's about the end of the discussion. Right? Grants are a good thing. You can get them, great. And then you probably heard them say something like, well, they're really hard to get, but good luck, right? And I'm not casting aspersions here. That's all true. They are hard to get, right? And they are difficult for humanities and social science scholars to sort of gain a foothold. So that's all true. And a big part of that is institutional. So for instance, in a lot of STEM fields, there are entire offices devoted only for grant procurement. And I'm not just talking about the faculty, I mean for the students, right? I remember distinctly in one of my Jedi classes, there was an engineering student who was just irritated beyond belief that their grant writer hadn't gotten back to them yet with their proposal that they wanted that person to write. And I thought, what a weird world, right? That doesn't make any sense to me, that you just have this grant person, right, that does these things for you. Okay, so I don't want to downplay how difficult it is. In fact, I want to highlight that, but I also want to turn it into a possible challenge that we might meet. And so I'm going to talk a lot about the sort of meat and potatoes aspect of it. And so I should apologize, because my talk is not going to be nearly as scholarly as Aaron's, and not nearly as civically engaging as Jamie's. I'm going to try to avoid cynicism outright, but I'm going to talk a lot about just instrumental, functional ways that you might gain a foothold. So I'm sorry if that's not what you want to hear, but you could always just say, oh, the snow's coming, I gotta go. Okay. So it is really hard to get grants, and it's really hard to get substantial grants where you can afford to pay a graduate student as a research assistant, right? I know a lot of students here probably wish there was some summer funding available through grant work, and again, if you were in engineering, that might be true, but probably not here, right? And I should also note that one of the problems too is that grad students, you're not eligible to be principal investigators. You have to usually be a faculty member, so that's a problem too. But I'll talk more about that later. Okay, but generally speaking though, these exhortations that you get in professional development you don't get very far practically. They generally come, in my experience, in two varieties. You'll get kind of maybe a hanger-on approach, like, hey, that's a really cool thing you scientists are doing, but have you thought of a philosophy approach? It's like, well, maybe, but probably not. And if they did, they're going to look for you, right? So that's hard to get very far. On the other hand, sometimes people will say, well, there's just not a lot there, and so, you look for small endowment grants, little travel awards that cobble together a little bit something, but there's just not a lot there. And again, those things are all true, but I want to make the case that there is a lot more opportunity out there. If scholars are willing to poke around some corners that might not seem apparent, the awkward spaces of grant getting, the awkward spaces I think aspect students can inhabit. I think as doers of interdisciplinarity, that you are all uniquely primed to go investigate these areas. And I should also point out that I'm not here to tell you how to do your jobs, right? If you have a path that doesn't require sponsored research, that's great, right? If you think the grant game is going to be too sort of soul-sucking for you and you don't have anything that you think could be funded, that's fine too. Again, now might be a good time to go get coffee, right? But I would simply point out that no matter what you're doing, there's usually some kind of way that you might get it sponsored. And the worst that anybody can say is no, right? So maybe it's worth looking at some of these avenues. And I would also point out that the Frankfurt School Institute for Social Research was established via an endowment. And Horkheimer was constantly getting grants to keep it running, right? So even if you're a critical scholar, you still need to think about these things, like how you're going to pay for your research. And so I just want to put that out there because I want to get something out of the way. And it's going to be one of those neon signs in big capital letters, the neoliberal university. It's all true, all of it. Right, all the things that you're told, it's all happening, that we have been commoditized to be units of knowledge producers, and our students have been commoditized to be consumers of those discrete units of knowledge. As customers of the just-in-time knowledge production facility, you call it a university. Their satisfaction and life chance securing outcomes become paramount via a neoliberal logic. Much like a difficult customer might send a steak back to be done again at a restaurant, so too do we have students who send their grades back to us. So that we might have the opportunity to give them the correct grade. The one they've earned. The one they've paid for. So let's get this collective wince out of the way. Take a moment, exhale, and let's move on. We need to plow ahead. And I'll make the case for this. And I think this is appropriate. And I don't want to step on Aaron Stoller's toes, who knows a lot more about the way universities function than I do. But I just want to give you a brief history of the university. And it goes a way back, before neoliberalism was dropped on our heads in 1973. You used to be able to get a master's degree if you stayed out of jail for a few years after your baccalaureate and paid a small fee. Right? You get a master's degree. We now call that institutional giving, right? Something like that. Okay. PhDs used to walk through the streets with their bell sleeves open to collect alms, right? And we call that sponsored research now. Right? And so while we have these different modes of institutional advancement and sponsored research, I really just want to mention these things briefly so that we might avoid a nostalgia for the golden age of the university that probably never was. Now, you could argue that the neoliberal university is an intensification of these trends, these standardizations of informationalism and customer satisfaction-oriented pleasure cruises for consumers. And I think that's undoubtedly true. In my own institution, like many others, we have to do the sort of brute calculations of how many adjuncts we need to hire, how many classes we need to fill, with how many students, so we can hit our fee structure just right, and maybe, if we're lucky, get some more travel funding. This is to say nothing, by the way, about the academic job market, but let's ignore that shared trauma for now. This is a safe space. We're having such a nice time. Suffice it to say that we should not be surprised that an institution within a regime of neoliberalism reflects that neoliberal logic. With states retreating from their responsibility for funding public education, and here I'll talk about my current state of Arizona, which hovers at about 10% funding for Arizona State University. They give us about $270 million on a $2.7 billion budget. I get that's a big budget, but either way. Right? And tuition and, you guessed it, grants are supposed to make up for this 10% gift that we're given. And if you really dig into the funding, you might find some odious line items. For instance, the Arizona-backed, or in Arizona, the Koch-backed School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership has a line item for $4.5 million that can only go to that center, right? So we don't get that money, okay? And similar schools have been placed at other Arizona Board of Regents schools, the University of Arizona, Northern Arizona University. I don't have to tell you about the Virginia schools, Virginia Tech and George Mason. Like, we know that there's strings attached to public funding, right? And so the state recedes, and grant-funded research is supposed to fill that gap. I guess what I'm saying is, if the alternative is Koch enterprises, maybe grant work isn't so bad. And I know it sounds like maybe I'm painting a dour picture here. You know, sell your soul, get a grant, you know, keep Koch Industries at bay. But I think what I'm trying to make is the case that our universities have always been, in the US especially, to some degree, sites of, you know, neoliberal, state, late capitalism, whatever you want to call it, right? And of course, because we're all good dialecticians here, we all probably think that universities can be so much more, that they can better fulfill the teleology if only we just did it better, right? And I think that has to be true, otherwise why are we doing this, right? I mean, we all know the horror stories. If we don't think universities can be these, you know, sites of civic education and, you know, virtue development or whatever, then why are we doing this? And we can talk about the teleology of the university once we have completed our long march through the institution. I'm going to sprinkle little Marcuse quotes all over the place, by the way. Yeah. I have a reputation on campus, by the way, and this is a direct quote. I'm a hardcore Marcuse guy. It's accurate, right? So when I talk about like doing grant research as a way to sort of procure employment, retain employment, it's all sort of in a way tactical, right? And I'm also going to make the case that it's kind of fun in a way, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. But I want to focus on this notion of broader impacts and what that means and how this notion of broader impacts can be used by interdisciplinary scholars, especially of a critical bent, to gain a foothold in sponsored research. So I guess I want to talk about how I learned to stop worrying and secure a grant. So I am at a Research 1 institution, and so because of that, I felt an informal pressure to get grant work to advance my career in the way that I wanted, right? And for better or worse, all the neoliberal caveats apply to the logic of that kind of stuff, right? And at Arizona State University, our sponsored projects office is called OKED, the Office of Knowledge Enterprise Development. Okay? The second in command in the university administration, directly under the president and co-equal to the provost, is the head of that office. So this should give you a sense of how institutionally, you know, this stuff is valued. And this person said to us at the faculty welcome back that the university looks at its faculty first and foremost as entrepreneurs. So like I said, a really informal pressure to get grant money. We have been asked to double our grant funding in the next 5 years, so something on the magnitude of turning $400 million into $800 million. So, you know, like no pressure, no big deal, we're just going to bring in a lot of money, right? So I logged on to our program called Pivot, which is essentially Google for grants, and I typed in the word leadership because I am putatively now a leadership scholar. Right. By the way, Virginia Tech's Office of Sponsored Projects, OSP, has a similar looking program called Funding Institutional that should help you find some sponsored research projects. I recommend you log in and have a look. See what's out there for faculty, grad students, or for potential collaborations. You never know. So I went through what was listed, and I found this program through NSF called GOLD, Geo Opportunities for Leadership Development. Sounds nice. It's a new initiative to address the lack of diversity in geoscience faculties in the US relative to other STEM fields. And what really drew me to it was that it was an invitation to an ideas lab. And it wasn't like a full proposal. It was this like mini proposal to come talk to other people. And a team of industrial occupational psychologists determined that I could work well with others, which we all can. And so I was invited for an intensive week-long experience comprised of 10 geoscientists, 10 social scientists, and 10 diversity, equity, and inclusion experts. We were sequestered in a hotel in Annapolis, Maryland, and told to form groups and pitch ideas to the whole group immediately as if we were on Shark Tank. It was horrifying. But I learned a few things. First, NSF wants fresh ideas about broad impacts of science. They are sick of hearing about pipelines, same old things being tried. They really want new ideas. And that's why they brought in social scientists and diversity experts to sort of spur that creative interdisciplinary collaboration. And they want this stuff, right? Second, they wanted social scientists in particular for a reason. It turns out that we're really good at recognizing the challenges to the broader social impacts of scientific endeavors. Right? We're actually really good at seeing those things and formulating what they're doing and how we can, frame them in terms of what's socially useful, or whatever you want to call it. It's almost as if we do this stuff for a living, right? The third thing I learned is that our STEM brethren, at least the ones I've been working with, right, they really care about this stuff. Like, they want to know about how their research can be socially useful, right? So this whole like STEM, non-STEM divide, I think, is really reductive and kind of overdetermined and isn't, I think, totally reflective of reality. We all want to do good, effective work. And, sure, there are positivists, but as an aside, if you want to not get a grant, you should definitely show off your Horkheimer chops, right? That's not a good way to do it, right? Even if you're right. Again, we're thinking strategically here. And, later over beers, you can talk with your collaborators and kind of like talk about this stuff. It's fine. Right? Fourth, I learned that this kind of like multi-year collaboration results in a really strong like professional feedback loop that really helps develop your career in ways that may be instrumental, but also I think really effective. And again, I think it's worth looking into these things. Okay. So we were thrown into this hotel, we formed groups immediately, we pitched ideas for what we wanted to do to achieve these outcomes. And they became increasingly less terrible with each iteration, and at this point I should note that they told us there's only so much money to go around. So we were competing with each other, like at the time too, right? And by the end of this, our groups had solidified, our ideas had coalesced, and we were then invited to submit a full proposal, wherein I learned about how to do a budget. I know that sounds really simple, it's really hard to do, right? And it's worth like going through that stuff just so you know how to do it. I ended up taking leadership of our small group, and that's how I became the principal investigator, I guess. Although they're co-PIs, right? Like, we're not hierarchical. And I think it was because I really focused on the broader impacts of our proposed study, how what we were doing was going to lead to broader socially desirable benefits and outcomes. Or maybe because convincing 2 oceanographers, an atmospheric scientist, and a medical biologist that a grounded theory study with no hypothesis was the best way to gather data. They didn't just like wash their hands of that. Said, yeah, you're in charge. They trusted me, and I'm just trying not to betray their trust. I'll take it, right? And so I keep talking about broader impacts and what those means. And so I should explain how NSF does their merit criteria evaluation. NIH, the National Institutes for Health, and NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric help me out?
Yeah.
Administration? Yeah. They have similar language. NSF just has, I think, the most clearly delineated broader impacts. And so when you are submit a proposal, they review it based on the merit criteria, and it's bifurcated into intellectual merit and broader impacts. Each solicitation will have some clarifying questions about how they want them answered, but those are like the 2 categories, right? And so intellectual merit is the potential to advance knowledge. I don't need to explain that one really, right? Like this basic research, or what Veblen called idle curiosity, right? Broader impacts is a little thornier. That's defined as the potential to benefit society and contribute to the achievements of specific desired societal outcomes. In other words, they want scientists to explain how their projects will benefit communities or society at large, especially if that's not immediately apparent. And we've all seen those stories about wasteful spending, like, oh, they put lasers on trout, and how wide it's $20 million, and what are they doing? And it turns out, of course, that it's a really important study, and when you actually hear it explained, it makes perfect sense, right? They just want you to make it make perfect sense up front, right? That's what broader impacts are supposed to do. And this is the really sticky stuff. And it turns out this is one of the big motivating factors behind the Ideas Lab. It turns out scientists have a really difficult time articulating the broader impacts of their projects. It's not their fault, right? It's not like they definitely think about the desired societal outcomes. Again, I'm strongly resisting this notion of STEM scientists as unthinking laboratory automatons, right? Like, that's not true. But what they often lack, in my experience, is a discourse for describing and measuring these outcomes that they're thinking about. Because doers of interdisciplinarity might also value intellectual humility, we might also note that we would have a similarly difficult time using their language to describe research designs that take place in the laboratory. Nevertheless, I think here there is a real chance to build an interdisciplinary collaboration. And I pause to note that yes, I suppose this may seem like a capitulation, right? I'm proposing that you should go do work that the scientists want to do, and you should go do it in their realm. And maybe there's some truth to that criticism, but I would respond with 2 points. First is that you go where the action is, right? And second, that what you do can be ported, right? So this work I'm doing now with Geo can easily be moved over to a different directorate, you know, the SBE, the Social and Behavioral Economics, which I know is its own problematic category, right? So by this I mean that if you're doing good work with people that want to do good work and you're doing work that's important, who cares where it is, right? Do the work. If you find a project you can contribute to, it can expand to wherever you need it to go. And you get paid to do it? Not much, but you get paid to do it, right? And again, I'm not really talking here about the meat of the grant, and that's on purpose. We'll talk, if you want, later about that. And I'm not here to just tell you like how great my grant work is. In fact, it's actually really difficult, and I often feel like I'm drowning, and I don't know what to do, and I'm constantly having to like get a hold of people who can sort of like explain to me what I'm supposed to be doing as I'm administering this grant, right? But I, again, want to avoid, there's not this ambivalence, right? But I don't want to, again, pressure you. Like, you know, you do it or don't. Whatever's going to work for you, right? Whatever formal or informal pressures you face at your institution, I hope you can find opportunities to do what you need to do to get where you want to go, right? But if you think it might be a good move for you to explore sponsored research, I want to highlight some institutional, professional, and personal benefits. And then I want to briefly explain why I think that regardless of how you feel about grant work and the neoliberal university and all that stuff, that there might still be a strategic justification for engaging in sponsored research. So institutionally, I think it's really good to build up a culture of collaboration. Aspect is, of course, interdisciplinary and collaborative, and it's increasingly being recognized as on the cutting edge of interdisciplinary problem-based inquiry. And the work that you're all doing, making me look good, right? VT has a really strong track record generally of doing this. So I will note that of the 30 participants in the Ideas Lab, 2 were professors from Virginia Tech, one of whom, by the way, works with Max Stevenson, right? There were 2 Virginia Tech graduates, 1 person from engineering education, and me, right? So 4 of the 30 people were Hokies, so to speak. I think this can be leveraged, this institutional culture of collaboration, and it can be a good way to leverage your place to do good interdisciplinary work. And I recommend you go look over at engineering education. They're doing a lot of work over there that could use some good social science and humanities-based research. A lot of linguistic analysis, interview analysis. You'll do some really intense qualitative coding. So if they're hiring, you should definitely look into it. I think that's really important to do. It gets your name out there, you become a known quantity, you become known as a person from a great place that does good work, and getting your name out there is really important. I don't think I have to tell you how important it can be to be noticed by people as you get ready to finish your PhD, right? It's important to do. So while I mentioned that graduate students aren't generally eligible to serve as principal investigators, that shouldn't stop you from looking at the grants that are available. Bring them to your advisor, pester them about it. Say, wouldn't this be great if you did this? Subtext, and then paid me over the summer. And faculty, those of you who can make it, you might consider doing the same. It's an arduous process, but again, the worst I can say is no. Professionally, I think there are a few ways that engaging in sponsored research has really helped me out in some really quotidian, everyday ways, and then some sort of broader, more abstract ways. I mean, having this experience can help land you a job, of course, but I want to focus more on the sort of everydayness of administering a grant. First, you're going to learn a lot about your institution's business office, how it works, how the sausage gets made, so to speak, right? You're going to learn how to do a budget and a budget justification, and you are going to annoy the hell out of these people because you're not going to know what you're doing. But you're going to learn, and it's going to be really great. So when you have to put together a budget, if you want to take on some initiative later, you know what to do, right? This is good, portable knowledge. Also, I will argue that in terms of your workflow, grant work will force you, and it will force your research into a comprehensive, visible, 5 to 6 year, subtext tenurable project, right? For instance, my colleagues helped me draw up a publication schedule for our grant work. We're going to pull four articles out of this 3-year grant, right? And that's really great because the data collection is sort of sporadic enough where you can do these things. And what helps with that is, it helps that our data collection schedule is at regular intervals, so we have our work laid out for us. And then secondly, and this is maybe just something scientists do normally, we have bi-weekly conference calls with homework. So every other Tuesday we get on the phone, my conference line, and we talk about what we're doing, we give each other assignments, and we come back in 2 weeks having done those things. So we're always completing tasks for each other, building that mutual regard and trust, and building toward these projects. And that's a really important thing to do. Those of you who are writing a dissertation, I don't want to point out that you're writing a dissertation. I know it's the last thing you want to talk about, right? But that kind of constant engagement and sort of constant accountability to yourself or others is a really great habit to get into. So on that sort of everyday level, it's a really great thing to do. So as a result, I've become a lot more organized, and I can better articulate a layout of where my research is going and what it's doing, and it's really helped me out. I could do without the quarterly and annual reports to the NSF, but that's a small price to pay. I have to talk to those folks a lot, it turns out, using public money and all. And I know this might sound a little bit banal, but this regimentation has really made me a more productive scholar, right? Not necessarily as prolific as some of the people in this room, but I'm working up to it. Now don't get me wrong, I still love to do my critical theory stuff. I have been lucky to be able to find the time to still work on my Frankfurt School critical theory and publish in places like New Political Science and Fast Capitalism. These are great journals, and if you're not a member of New Political Science, as a membership director, I should tell you, join. It's cheap and it's fun, and you make me look real good if our numbers go up. Thanks in advance. And so I write about Marcuse and theory and Marxism, and it's a lot of fun. And what I'm suggesting is that the regimentation from my grant life has flowed over to my other research interests as well. Now look, I don't want to overstate my case. I'm not saying getting a grant is going to be some super serum for brilliance. You're already brilliant. But if you have calendar management problems like I did, i.e. not being able to see more than a week into the future, this kind of collaborative effort will really help with that. Highly recommend it. Again, this is part of my self-critique. So thanks for listening. Finally, of course, it helps professionally getting things like letters of recommendation, a possible tenure letter writer, or whatever kind of reference you need. So for instance, one of my collaborators, he's the vice provost of sponsored research at his university, and that's a really great person to have writing a letter for a job application that says you can do pretty good research, right? That's been a big help. And so I guess I'm echoing what you already know, but it's something that I wish I had done earlier and more of. You really need to network and like talk to people and get to know folks. It's really important, so please do that. I wish I had done that earlier. Don't make the mistakes I did. Personally, I have made new friends and colleagues. And I'm not trying to get mushy here, but these people I work with, I've grown to genuinely regard as comrades in the academy, even though they're oceanographers and atmospheric scientists. The ability to build these sorts of solidarity networks, I think, is really vital, especially across institutions. Grant work can be a great way to build these networks and feel like you are indeed at home. And I think that's really important for us, and maybe I'm just telling on myself again here, but being in a sort of interstitial, not quite what I got my degree in faculty right now, knowing that there are other academics out there who see the value in our shared collaborative work is a really centering experience for me. This seems to me like it's a key aspect of doing interdisciplinarity. Since you may not have those disciplinary structures in place to center you, the ability to build your own networks of scholars to sustain you in a community of your choosing can be a really vital tactic to sort of keep you afloat. Because inevitably, I suspect you will feel lost at some point in your interdisciplinary lives. And these are ways of grounding yourself. I'm also able to do some good translation from science speak. And I will posit here that, again, this is a key part of doing interdisciplinarity. By translation, I mean neither that we must dumb down our discourse for other people in other fields, nor that we have some kind of Rosetta Stone through which all other disciplinary discourses may be understood, right? I'm not suggesting that. Rather, when we do interdisciplinarity as scholars surrounding a practical problem, we have ways of understanding each other, right, through that shared experience. This can be both comical and frustrating. I was interviewing geoscientists, and I had to Google half the terms they were using, like stratigraphy. I still don't know what that is. Further, when I started building my novel theory of what I'm calling solidarity leadership, a forthcoming publication, I was asked to explain it. And I started talking about species being and socialization via the labor process. And the response I got was, so it's like being nice to people, right? I thought, kinda, but I need to do a better job communicating, right? This is on me, okay? And so I thought, well, I'm working through these definitions, and it helped me not only explain what I meant with this term, solidarity leadership, it really helped me refine the contours of this theory by layering it. And it's not just personal regard, it's not being goal-oriented in an organization, but it's built on a vision to a shared commitment of given ends. And also, I know that stratigraphers, whatever they are working with anthropologists and historians to map ancient sites. It's pretty cool. I don't know how they do it, but it seems really cool. So in my, as I noted above, I said that part of my conclusion would be that this could be a tactical decision that you might undertake. And this may be the least intuitive part of my talk, and maybe the only actual part to contain an argument, so I'm sorry I buried the lead and waited so long to get to it. However, this may be the most important part, because apart from whatever you think about this whole realm of grant work and sponsored research, and it's certainly a mixed bag, there's quite a bit at stake. The consternation surrounding broader impacts within the scientific community is, of course, yielding efforts for understanding and dealing with them. And I'm going to highlight what I think are the two biggest tendencies. I had such a small world moment meeting Joey, who's at the University of North Texas. And there's a philosopher at the University of North Texas, Bob Frodman, whose job is doing interdisciplinary work and using applied philosophy to explain broader impacts to scientists. He's doing great work. He's an interdisciplinary philosopher who's been doing critical discourse analyses on the application of broader impacts. And what his projects look like are usually an assemblage of interdisciplinary scholars who engage the stated goals of a project and look at the myriad ways that broader impacts might be articulated or communicated, or what's being missed, or who the communities at stake are, and how to talk to them. That is, because of the consternation many scientists feel when they're articulating their broader impact section, it usually gets pretty flattened out. It gets pretty one-dimensional. They usually read something to the effect of, people will do this science thing and then they will like science. Okay. Frodman wants to probe where the normative and prescriptive statements and assumptions are in these impacts, and how they do indeed work or don't work toward a stated vision of the good. In a sense, he argues, the very idea of broader impacts is a philosophical and theoretical investigation about what is good, necessary, and just. Questions that many of us in the Aspect program are also concerned with. And so I'll say that Frodman's tendency is an interdisciplinary investigation of what impact is, and how it can be articulated and measured in a way that is both project-specific and clearly communicated to its broader social benefits. But there is another tendency. Ominous music cues. It is the National Association of Broader Impacts, the NABI. The NABI is a center out of the University of Missouri that does algorithmic analysis of funded proposals. So anything that gets funded, they run through and they look at what the broader impacts were, and then they draw some conclusions based on frequency and likelihood of being funded about what language gets proposals funded. Oh, you're seeing what's at stake. Good. You don't have to be a Marcusian, although you should, to see the danger in this tendency. All this statistical inference shows is what language gets funded relative to what topic the proposal is. It one-dimensionalizes broader impacts, imbuing them with a technological or quantitative rationality that becomes plug and play. You put in the terms that work because you want to get funded, and if you want to get funded, you use the terms that work. You are indeed putting knowledge to work. The terms that solidify, and we're going to edit that out, Marl, right? The terms that solidify and become de facto concepts, and any attempt to get out of those frameworks would then become ineffective, right? Your discursive challenges to these broader impacts would fall on deaf ears. Scientific rationality, as it sees itself in its broader societal goals, would become a hermetically sealed discourse that rejects interdisciplinary, problem-based thinking. Here you might object and say, well, you know, Robert, the NSF doesn't have to fund those projects. If they want new and innovative, then they can frustrate those algorithmic approaches. The problem with this is other scientists. Here's what I mean. When a proposal goes up for consideration, the NSF impanels scientists, either virtually or in Alexandria, to read the proposals. We score them based on a series of criteria, and then in some cases make an argument to the panel for or against funding a proposal. Scientists make up these panels, and so if we broadly accept that because scientists are frustrated by broader impacts, then as they themselves review broader impacts, they may be less likely to worry about them, or even be comforted by the NABI's typology. In my own experience as a panel reviewer, broader impacts are barely discussed on panels. But NSF makes everybody say something about all the criteria. And so I've been in a room full of scientists making the case that we need to pay attention to these things, right? And I'm not saying that there should just be more of me in these panel reviews. You should be there too. But I do think that we need critical scholars who do interdisciplinarity to make the case for these use-inspired, problem-based articulations of broader impacts. So let's call this the NABI tendency. Broader impacts being typologized through algorithmic assessment on what has previously worked. The two tendencies fighting for the soul of broader impacts is currently being fought. I'm on Frodman's side. You've probably figured that out by now. But that means building a critical mass of critical scholars who can engage with these broader impacts and contribute to a discussion about social goals within science. So I don't want to overstate my case. Again, if you go there and start railing about the dialectic of enlightenment, you're not going to get very far, okay? Nor do I think that the work that we're doing is like radically reforming the contours of knowledge production. You know, we can be honest with our self-assessments, right? But I would make the case that sponsored research can be a benefit to you, institutionally, professionally, and personally, and that participation in it can make for a space of recognition and reward that in some small way may combat instrumental rationality along the way. Thank you for listening to that. I hope you get home safely.